Attention! This ranking contains some spoilers for the Suicide Squad as well as the entire DCEU. If you wish to avoid any such spoilers, watch the Suicide Squad or any other DCEU films that you have yet to see, and then return to this video. If you couldn't care less about spoilers, then watch away. So the DCEU is kind of a divisive franchise, isn't it? They've definitely improved over the past few years, don't get me wrong, but they started out pretty rough, and for a shared universe like this, that can have dire consequences for the rest of the franchise. Not to mention, of their first 5 movies, only one of them is actually good. But honestly, I have hope for this franchise. They're never going to top the MCU, and right now they seem fully aware of that fact, going pretty bonkers with some of their films. So with the release of The Suicide Squad, we now have 10 films in the DC Extended Universe. I'm only including theatrical cuts of these movies, so no Batman v Superman Extended Cut or Zack Snyder's Justice League. When I do one of these rankings in the future, I'll probably include one or both of those movies. Anyway, so today I, the film watcher, shall be ranking every DCEU film from my least favorite to my favorite. Well, let's do this. In last place by far is Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice. This movie is awful. Don't get me wrong, some of the action is kind of cool, and seeing Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman team up at the end is kind of awesome, but the movie is so convoluted. It's so focused on setting up future movies that it sacrifices credibility and good storytelling. It's trying to cram in Man of Steel 2, The Batman 2, Batman vs. Superman, Batman and Wonder Woman, The Death of Superman, Justice League the setup, The Legion of Doom the setup, and probably more that I didn't pick up on. This is the second film in the entire DCEU, and in my opinion, it is by far the most obvious way you can tell that DC is trying to do what Marvel did without any of the effort or patience. The MCU set up its franchise in a deliberately paced way so they could have big payoff by the end. This movie tries to have the setup and the payoff at the same time, and it simply doesn't work. It has way too much going on to actually get anything real across. There's also a whole lot of disrespect for the main characters. Superman, who has a symbol on his chest that literally means hope, is portrayed as completely dull, empty, hollow, and, most importantly, hopeless. I guess he doesn't want to be Superman anymore because he caused too much damage? I mean, at least in Man of Steel, he was confronted with someone who had radically different ideals and methods than he, so there was kind of an interesting debate. I mean, I don't think it was handled all that well, and I will talk about that later, but this Superman doesn't do anything. He's technically the main character of the film, and he has no substantial arc or character growth whatsoever. I mean, the most interesting thing that happens to him is that he dies. And oh yeah, what's up with that? Why would you kill off Superman right now? This is the second movie in the franchise. I mean, they were clearly trying to have an I am Iron Man moment, but it didn't work, obviously, because they hadn't fully defined this character of Superman yet. And the other title character, Batman, isn't exactly done well either. It was sort of a trend at the time to have the superheroes in movies be super, brooding and dark, as if everyone was trying to make that character's version of the Dark Knight. The Amazing Spider-Man did this, Man of Steel did it, and TMNT did it, and those movies didn't work because the brooding loner hero story doesn't fit with those characters. You'd think that the dark brooding loner story would work for Batman because he's already a dark brooding loner. But somehow they went too far with the brooding thing and turned Batman into a violent psychopath. He's grabbing machine guns and mowing guys down like he's the Punisher. He's spreading the bat signal into people's skin like Wolverine or something. This isn't Batman. This isn't the Dark Knight. It's the dark murdering lunatic. He is also a complete idiot. I'm sorry. Mr. Snyder, have you ever heard the words, "the world's greatest detective"? Because that's what Batman is. He is not a bumbling buffoon who just happens upon random clues because the script needs him to. Also, what is going on with Lex Luthor in this movie? I like Jesse Eisenberg as much as the next guy, and he's technically not giving that bad of a performance from just a technical acting perspective, but he's so wildly miscast in the role. He's acting like Jim Carrey in Batman Forever. This is one of the least accurate comic book portrayals of all time. It's up there with Oscar Isaac as Apocalypse and Arnold Schwarzenegger as Mr. Freeze. It's maybe not that bad, but it's still bad. And of course, the plot culminates with the disastrous Martha scene. What a terrible scene. Batman and Superman's conflict is just magically resolved when they find out that their mothers have the same name. This is one of the most ridiculous scenes I've ever seen in a comic book movie. It's horribly acted and horribly written. What were they telling Ben Affleck to do? Just scream the line, "Why did you say that name?" as hammy and ridiculous as he possibly could? So yeah, I detest this movie. It's ridiculously convoluted and suffers entirely from the DCEU's feeble attempts to have what Marvel had without actually building the universe in an organic way. Number 9, Justice League, or Justice League. I think the new characters brought in are solid, and there are some funny jokes, but the whole movie is just such a cynical product. This film had a really rough production. I mean a really rough production, and man, does it show. And again, this is just DC trying to be like Marvel. They even brought in the same director of the Avengers. The MCU had origin films for each of the Avengers, and the DCEU had origin films for 2 members of the Justice League, one of which died in Batman v Superman. So they had to introduce 3 whole new characters, resurrect Superman, have the new Team Bond, then have him stop generic Space Conqueror guy, all in the studio-mandated, mind you, under 2 hours. I don't mind the new members of the Justice League, but they just kind of feel like an afterthought when they should be the main focus. Not to mention, the entire film feels so overly processed and over-edited. The Henry Cavill mustache thing never really bothered me, but the color correction is really distracting, especially in the climax. The entire third act of this film is a joke, most likely because they had Zack Snyder and Joss Whedon, 2 polar opposite filmmakers both working on their version of the movie, and it just ends up being such a disaster. Also, generic Space Conqueror guy is a terrible villain. He has generic motivations, a generic scheme, a generic design, and generic dialogue. He makes Malekith look like Thanos. So yeah, this movie is bad. I can only imagine that the Snyder Cut is better, but I haven't seen that, and thus am not including it in this list. Let's continue. Number 8, Wonder Woman 1984. Gal Gadot and Chris Pine still have great chemistry. I honestly kind of like Maxwell Lord as a villain. He has a okay plan, and it's also hilarious. I kind of like Barbara Minerva. The movie's pretty colorful. But with all that, I don't like this movie. My biggest problem here has to do with Steve Trevor, which is kind of weird, because Steve Trevor is one of the better parts of this movie. I don't have a problem with him as a character, but there was no reason for him to even be in this film. Nothing about the story requires him to be there. The Dreamstone thing could have just sucked Diana's powers away when anybody uses it, not just when she uses it. That makes slightly more sense than what was actually in the film. Then they wouldn't have had to bother explaining why Steve Trevor came back, because the explanation they gave is crap. He comes back in some other dude's body for some reason. I mean, half the time he just felt like Diana's henchman who ran around and helped her take out bad guys, and he doesn't even bring out anything good in her, like in the last movie. The real good movie. And the story, it makes 0 sense. How does Maxwell Lord get the power to grant wishes if he's just talking to people from their screens? Doesn't he need to have physical contact with them? And why doesn't he grant his son's wish? They show that he hears it, and he has to grant all the wishes. Why would everyone in the entire world take back their wishes? What if the leader of some foreign country wished for protection against a larger, more powerful nation, and they had to take that wish back, leaving the country vulnerable? What if he wished for a maniac who was trying to kill you to go to jail, and then he had to take it back? I can buy into a magical woman with a magic rope and an invisible jet who lives on an island filled with awesome female warriors, but I don't have enough hope in humanity to be able to buy that everyone would take back their wishes. The explanation for how they find this golden winged suit thing sounds like something 7-year-old me would come up with when I was playing with action figures. Once Barbara Minerva became the cheetah, I wanted to smash my face into a pillow. It looks worse than those fever dream inhabitants from 2019's Cats. The cheetah looks cool in the comics. Why does she look so bad here? The CG in this movie is terrible. I'm fine with a comic book movie being over the top, don't get me wrong, but this is really pushing it. The Wonder Woman TV show from the 70s was more adult-oriented than this thing. It's such a dumb movie. Number 7, Suicide Squad. I had some fun with this movie. I think the cast is solid across the board, Joker Leto excluded, but we'll get to him later. I like Will Smith as Deadshot and Margot Robbie as Harley Quinn. I think Amanda Waller is a cool villain. I really love the idea of this movie, but it has a horrible script and a horrible story, not to mention some woefully underdeveloped and highly underutilized characters. The cast is good, but these characters are so boring. Half of them are completely forgettable. I kid you not. Until I looked up the Wikipedia page for this movie, I forgot that Slipknot even existed. The story is also really all over the place, to the point where it doesn't even make a ton of sense. The script is pretty lackluster too. No character or relationship, aside from maybe Deadshot and Harley, is given time to develop in a natural way. So characters will just randomly sacrifice themselves and feel sad for totally unexplained reasons. The villain that's not Amanda Waller, Enchantress, is awful. She's one of the most ridiculous comic book movie villains of all time. She's up there with Nuclear Man from Superman 4, if we're being honest. She also employs a large army of bubble people. Seriously, her evil army looks like they were formed from the waste that was pulled from the darkest, dankest pits of the metropolitan sewer system. And her brother, Incubus, even though I could have sworn his name was Dominus, which is an infinitely cooler name than Incubus, he looks like Jamie Foxx's Electro if he suddenly entered the world of Tetris. And yes, we should talk about the annoyingly on-the-nose elephant in the room, Joker Leto. He sucks. This is a terrible version of the Joker. We know that the Joker is damaged. You don't need to tattoo his forehead to show us that. We know he likes smiling, so you don't need to tattoo a smile onto his hand. Could he not just smile in a regular way? What is going on here? I get that they wanted him to be this unpredictable part of the film because the Joker should be unpredictable, but why is he a side character? He should be the main villain. Does Warner Bros. Think I'd rather watch dancing idiots who employ bubbles rather than the greatest comic book villain of all time? What were they thinking here? This movie is just such a weird experience that I can't say I didn't enjoy it sometimes, but it's just a mess. And don't get me started on the production of this movie. Number 6, Aquaman. Aquaman is kind of dumb. The script in particular is very lackluster and pretty awkwardly written. I think this movie simultaneously didn't take itself seriously enough and took itself way too seriously. This results in the film often feeling like self-parody and feeling way too self-serious other times. The villains are not strong at all. Ocean Master is just a whiny little brat, and Black Manta, who is actually kind of cool, is forgotten about in the second half, completely. The movie kind of tries to have drama, but it doesn't work because this is a movie called Aquaman. It's also very derivative. The story is just Black Panther, even though that's what Aquaman's story is in the comics. The mom twist with Nicole Kidman feels so unnecessary to the story. It's also just the Janet thing from Ant-Man and the Wasp, except if that was built up throughout that film, this just feels randomly tossed in there. Also, why in the mother-fishing ocean would they mix in a cover of Africa by Toto with a terrible Pitbull song? This choice boggles my mind. I don't get it. Now, on the plus side, the action is pretty cool. I really like the use of wide shots and the cool angles here. Jason Momoa is great, and really the entire cast is pretty on point. The visuals are cool, and holy shark-repellent Batman. The climax is honestly kind of cool. So this isn't really a good movie, but it's really not that bad either. Surprisingly, an Aquaman movie could have been better. Number 5, Man of Steel. I like the ideas in this movie, a whole lot in fact. Having a darker and more grounded version of Superman, especially after the campiness of the Christopher Reeve movies, should have worked very well. However, I think they went a bit too far with this. They got the screenwriter of The Dark Knight to pen the script for this film, and the super dark, brooding style of that movie doesn't work especially well here because they kind of rob Superman of everything that he is. Heck, I don't even think the grounded take worked that well in The Dark Knight. Back to this film. It's really drab and very dull, and it doesn't really fit the story or the character in any sense. The cast is all pretty solid, and Henry Cavill should be great as Superman, but he doesn't really have an interesting version of the Man of Steel to work with, despite having a good performance. I like Amy Adams and Lawrence Fishburne in their respective roles. I think Zod works really well conceptually. I mean, the execution is not great because he spends half the movie yelling. It is ridiculous. He has some exchanges with Superman, especially in the climax, that work really, really well for me. But every time he starts shouting, it just gets so cartoonish and over the top. The climax is just absurd in the amount of damage caused. How do these two guys create more damage than the Avengers in the movie The Avengers? And oh yeah, what the heck is up with Jonathan Kent in this movie? Why does he seem totally okay with Clark letting a bus full of youths die? Why does he not want Clark to save him in the tornado part? Clark could have just zipped over there and gotten him out really fast so nobody could see. Is this supposed to be a sad moment of sacrifice? What is going on here? So yeah, this movie is really close to being very good, but it has some really stupid stuff in it. Number 4, Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of one Harley Quinn. Yeah, I enjoy this movie. I really like the storytelling style here. It's done totally out of order, and I think it works very well. Harley Quinn is still great, and I like how much focus the movie gives her in particular. The other members of the Birds of Prey are solid, specifically Black Canary. I love Black Mask in this movie and the portrayal from the amazing Ewan McGregor. I liked Zaz too, despite him not really being comic accurate, but that doesn't really bother me that much. The action in this film is phenomenal. It's all done practically and it works really, really well. I especially enjoyed the climax and the prison break scene. This movie is super stylized and I really like it. With that said, this movie has the completely wrong title. It should be called Harley Quinn and the Birds of Prey or something like that. It's like, instead of calling the Avengers, you called it Iron Man and the totally epic formation of the Avengers. The Birds of Prey themselves aren't a very compelling team either. I thought most of them were fine individually, but they don't get a lot of time to actually be a group. With that said, it's still an entertaining film. Number 3, Wonder Woman. My only issue with Wonder Woman is the third act. It really slows down when the Ares reveal happens, and the movie turns into one of those dumb, ultra-generic mythological war films. The design for Ares is hilariously lame. The actor and the character himself is just really uninteresting. Even though I love David Thewlis as an actor, and even though he's clearly trying with this role, he simply doesn't work as a villain. And the other bad guys, General Ludacris and Dr. Pisshead, aren't particularly interesting either. It's a pretty weak third act that kind of drags down the entire experience. However, when this movie is great, it is great. Gal Gadot is literally perfect as Wonder Woman. She captures the heroic and powerful nature of the character so well as the naivete. Also, she just looks exactly like Wonder Woman. And then there's Steve Trevor, played by the always charming and delightful Chris Pine. These two have excellent chemistry and form a really nice little bond throughout the course of the story. I also really like Steve Trevor's friends. The action is handled really well, despite all the slow-mo. The emotional beats in this film work very nicly, especially with Steve's sacrifice at the end there. I also love Diana's arc in this film, where she realizes that mankind is very, very flawed, and there's something very powerful to me about a person having their core beliefs totally broken down, only to rekindle those beliefs themselves. It's a great arc, and I love the scenes where Diana just sees what a mess humanity really is. Man, if she's shocked by this, imagine how she would react to 2020, especially because that dumb sequel to this film came out that year. Anyway, so this movie probably could have been great with a couple tweaks, but it's still really good. Number 2, Shazam! I love this movie. It's awesome. Shazam, surprisingly, is one of my favorite comic book characters of all time. And that could be because he's endlessly relatable, but the concept of a kid being turned into a magic adult is something only a child could dream of. And I mean that in the best way imaginable. Zachary Levi is so perfect for this role. He just embodies this complete and entirely literal man-child with mind-blowing ease. Also, I think Billy Batson has a really strong character arc. The stuff with his parents is pretty visceral and powerful, and I like that he learns to accept his newfound family. Speaking of which, every member of his newfound family is extremely charming and delightful. The standout, of course, is Freddie Freeman, who I find hilarious. Yeah, this movie's comedy is great, but it also has a great big lightning bolt-shaped heart behind all the superhero stuff. The action is really cool, and I love the montage where they test out all Billy's powers. That is totally something I would do, and I would definitely play Queen music in the background. The villain is sympathetic enough to be relatable, but hammy enough to feel right at home in this film in particular. The visuals in this film are great. I admit, I wish the Seven Deadly Sins had a cooler design like in some of the comics. The same goes for the Wizard. Seriously, this Wizard's costume is hilariously bad. Dumb designs aside, I still love this movie. But at number 1 is The Suicide Squad. What a magnificent improvement over the original disaster. This movie has some incredible characters. Every single member of the Suicide Squad is interesting and fun. Even the worst of them, like Mongal and Blackguard, are still kind of funny. The best characters on the team are the best characters in the entire DCEU. Bloodsport is a great central character, but I knew he was going to be great. Same with Peacemaker and Harley Quinn. A few huge surprises were Ratcatcher 2, a really nice optimistic presence throughout the film, and Polka Dot Man, who had a really depressing backstory and some great payoff. And of course, you have to talk about King Shark. What an amazing character. He's just so sweet and endearing, and the scene where he confesses to Ratcatcher 2 that he doesn't have any friends was just very sad to me, and then he finds friends by the end of the film. If you've said to me 3 years ago that there would be a film that made a version of King Shark, more interesting than a version of Batman, I would have scoffed. But thanks to the horribly beautiful mind of James Gunn, that is what we have. Unlike when he was working for Disney, James Gunn is just able to run wild with this film. This is him at his absolute edgiest, to the point where he makes Guardians of the Galaxy, which was already one of the edgier MCU films, look like a Mickey Mouse cartoon. The amount of violence, gore, and death in this film is shocking. I mean, I was expecting them to kill off a few members of the team. I was not expecting them to kill off all but 5 of them. And it's not just members of the team or just the antagonist. No, no, no. There are several innocent people who are violently slaughtered, and some of them were even played for laughs. Speaking of which, this movie is hilarious. It had me laughing the entire way through. Also, speaking of which, the action is glorious to behold. A lot of it's done practically, which, in my opinion, works to the film's favor. The entire movie is just soaked in style, James Gunn style. It's also not afraid to be kind of disgusting, especially in the climax. Speaking of the climax, Starro is such an absurd villain, and I kind of love him for that reason alone. Also, this movie did that thing where the characters address each other by their superhero names, but it doesn't bother me here, surprisingly, even though it does in the X-Men films. If I had to nitpick, I'd say I don't love the side romance between Harley Quinn and generic Corto Maltesan guy. Yeah, the Corto Maltesans in general were pretty generic, but even with those minor issues, I still really, really loved this movie, so yes, without question, it is my favorite film in the DCEU. And that's it. Share your own ranking if you wish. Remember to like this video and subscribe for more in its ilk. Thank you for watching, and as always, remember to keep calm and watch.